This session is picking up on a statement that John McDonnell made in spring 2016, where he said at the State of the Economy conference that it was the ambition of the next Labour government to surpass the achievements of the Attlee government. Yay! So we've got some fantastic people here to chat a bit about, do we think that's possible, but more to the point, assuming that the will would be there, what obstacles would be standing in the way of that Labour government? And we're going to focus on three areas mainly: the city, finance, nationalisation, forces against nationalisation, and the media. I just want to give a little intro to each of our wonderful contributors here. I might stand up for this, it's a bit easier and I can look at you. John Christensen is founder of the Tax Justice Network, which I think some of you will be very familiar with. He's an economist and what's called a forensic auditor. He's currently chair of Tax Justice Network, which he co-founded, a former economic advisor to the government of Jersey. Do we boo at that? No, you turned it to good use. You turned it to good use. In addition to his work with Tax Justice, he's a board member of Tax Inspectors Without Borders. That's something. He's been described, this is great, described by The Guardian as the unlikely figurehead of a worldwide campaign against tax avoidance. His research on offshore finance has been widely published in books, featured in a number of TV and film documentaries, and most recently, and I would urge you to try and get to see it, he co-produced a fantastic film called The Spider's Web, which is looking at how fallout from the British Empire, which seemingly evaporated, just moved into something else, and that's offshore finance. It's brilliant. Cat Hobbs is the founder of We Own It. It's a new organisation that aims to be the voice for public service users and public ownership. She previously worked at Campaign for Better Transport. That was in Bristol. London, where she lobbied nationally on behalf of bus and train passengers. She's also campaigned locally in Bristol and Oxford and is a regular contributor to The Guardian. Pablo Navarrete is a British-Chilean journalist and documentary filmmaker. He's the founder and editor of Alborada.net, which is a website covering Latin American related issues such as politics, media and culture. And he's co-editor of the magazine of that same name, Alborada Magazine. He's a filmmaker. His first feature-length documentary was Inside the Revolution, a journey into the heart of Venezuela. The latest televised version of his second documentary, The Colombia Connection, was released in November 2012. He's the producer of the documentary Chile Student Uprising. You should go to Alborada. If you want to know what's going on in Venezuela, Chile, Latin America generally, politics, culture, that's, I would say, the go-to website to get in-depth reporting. And he's also the co-director, most recently, of Truce, which will be released in 2017, and it has charted the Colombian peace process. He was also the Venezuelan researcher for John Pilger's The War and Democracy in 2007. He speaks and covers contemporary Latin American issues across all news outlets, the BBC, Al Jazeera, writes for the New Statesman, Guardian, HuffPost and Russia Today. So between them, they can cover an awful lot of bases. So I just wanted to kick off with two things, as we're going to focus on public ownership, nationalisation as one issue. And I'm going to read a little bit, just a tiny little bit from an interview that John McDonnell gave to The Guardian, The Independent, if I can find it. So many bits of paper here. Bear with me, caller. I think it's getting to the end of the day and the bits of paper, here we go. Too many bits of paper, even for Virgo. Right. So we want to talk about, can Labour surpass and what would stand in its way. So John McDonnell, this year, vowed that Labour's goal would be to transform capitalism with consequences far more reaching than the Attlee government's establishment of the welfare state and the NHS. He said the aims of a Corbyn government would be to, in the life of one parliament, lay the foundations of a new society that is radically fairer, more equal and more democratic. Too many governments in the past, and not just this current one, thought that government should only intervene when something goes wrong. He said, we believe that government intervention should be there to make sure things go right. When we return to government, we must aspire to be another great reforming administration. I want us to surpass even the Attlee government for radical reform. The situation demands nothing less. Simply undoing the damage inflicted by David Cameron and George Osborne will be a huge task, but we should aim even higher than this. So, when we think about what Labour nationalised from 45 on, coal, Bank of England, National Health Service of course, British Electricity, cable and wireless, all rail, inland water transport, road haulage, I mean this was all in the film, some passenger transport, gas, iron and steel, and we've covered electricity. I mean that was a massive programme for change. So with those two things in our heads, I just wanted to ask each of you in turn, you'll be fairly familiar with the current Labour manifesto, what they went in with. Where does that manifesto now, as it sits, stand in terms of this aspiration? And how much further would you say it has to go? John.
Okay, first of all, Attlee, the connection between Attlee and John McDonnell, who as you know I work with,
Yeah.
is that both of them recognised that the City of London was not a great strength for the UK economy, it was a threat to the UK economy. We host one of the world's biggest financial centres. Many people think of it as a huge net asset to the economy, but actually our banking sector is one of the UK's great weaknesses. It's almost entirely offshore. If you look at the City of London, it is technically a state within a state, but the banking sector itself is pretty damn poor at doing what a banking sector should do, which is channel savings into investment. In terms of understanding risk, they are very weak indeed. As we saw 10 years ago, very few of the bankers actually understood the gravity of the financial crisis as it built up. They knew it was happening, and they were trying to hide that it was happening, and they were trying to divest themselves of whatever risks they had, plug it off to the next person, but they didn't understand the nature of the risk. We don't actually have a banking sector that's fit for purpose. So one of the key commitments that John McDonnell has made is to have a national investment bank. Because anybody who knows anything about investing in the big kind of transitions that we need to make, for example, a green economy, knows that we don't actually have a capitalist banking sector that's interested in making that kind of investment happen. So that's one of the commitments he's made, and I think it would be a major and important step forward if we want to be visionary about, for example, making that huge step towards a greener economy. The second thing that he said, and quite rightly, and he was criticised enormously by the press, but the press by and large, I'm afraid, are economically illiterate, is we are going to close down on the private finance initiative. Now, the private finance initiative was, from word go, one of the biggest rip-offs ever. For those of us who have long memories, and my as an economist goes back to the 1970s, at that time British bankers were all moaning because too many really big investments were going ahead through government bonds and government borrowing, and they were saying the government's crowding out our most profitable activities, they wanted it back. And to his great shame, actually, I think one of the greatest weaknesses of Tony Blair was he bought into this idea that the government should borrow money from the private sector. As a former government advisor and treasurer, that's the weakest and most stupid way of borrowing money that's possible. You know, if anyone can issue bonds or create money, it's the government. Yet we borrow from the private sector at astonishingly high rates and broke our National Health Service and broke many parts of our education service simply through these astonishing debts. Now the stupidity of the press lies in the idea that it's going to cost a fortune to buy back this. No, that's not the way bonds work. You issue bonds and governments can borrow at very, very low interest rates, far lower than the current interest rates which are breaking the back of the NHS And these are long-term commitments which pension funds are desperately wanting to have anyway. It's economically illiterate to say it would cost too much to renationalise many of these debts. Quite the opposite. In the long run, we will save ourselves fortunes. And why is that discussion not happening? Now, I spent the last week working in Luxembourg, and as you probably know, this week we took Amazon to court successfully. And one of the reasons I was in that performance needs to be our man in Luxembourg for the press around the world. One of the things that John McDonnell understands very, very well is that, and a gentleman in the previous session was talking about, we need to understand how capitalism has changed since Attlee. One of the things that's changed enormously is that capitalism has by and large become dominated by rent-seeking multinational companies. I'll explain what that means if anyone doesn't understand what rent-seeking is. Amazon is one of those who don't actually redistribute their wealth because they sit offshore in Luxembourg and don't pay any taxes and don't contribute at all to our lot. John McDonnell understands this very, very well. Now, unfortunately, British capitalism is perhaps the world leader alongside US capitalism in precisely this kind of tax avoidance. And our capitalists are not that interested in producing wealth. They're more interested in extracting wealth. In other words, the City of London is not really in the business of creating wealth or investing in long-term projects. It's more interested in managing our pension funds and our savings or whatever, or issuing huge amounts of debt finance to consumers and extracting rental incomes from that. We need to tackle that wholesale, not just by tackling the tax avoidance, but by transforming our tax system entirely. You know, if you listen to what the current government and other governments, whilst I was in Luxembourg, the finance minister there was saying publicly in the same room as me, we need to become more competitive, we need to reduce taxation on big companies. Quite the opposite. The big companies are sitting on such piles of cash, they have no idea what to do with their reserves. And the only way we can make cash productive is by taxing it and redistribution. So John McDonnell has no fears about introducing a land value tax, a financial transaction tax, a wealth tax, raising the level of corporation tax, breaking the way in which the wealthy elites in this country have shifted all their wealth into offshore trusts and offshore companies, put an end to all this nonsense, close down the British tax haven empire. In other words, he sees all of this as part and parcel of a transformation, the necessary transformation of British financial capitalism. Now, of course, they're going to squeal like dogs once they're challenged in this way, and they're going to say we're going to go offshore and we're going to go away, we're going to move, but actually it's not that easy for them to do it. And trust me, in the long run, this country would be far better off if some of them do precisely that, because they're not actually interested in investing in this country. They're simply invested in extracting this country, extracting wealth from this country. The key thing that John McDonnell will face will be how to stop a run on sterling.
Yeah.
But of course, that's precisely what Mrs May has been facing since the Brexit vote, this run on sterling. And sterling has actually come down considerably in value. It was massively overvalued anyway, reflecting the very weak, this downward thing, reflects the very weak productivity and the decades of underinvestment in this country. But I think John understands very well that if we need to go for a long run thing, in other words, reinvesting in a whole host of things, whether it's council housing or a long-term commitment to a green economy or whatever, that will require a lot of investment, which will feed through. But he understands that it's going to be a long run, a long haul. But it can be transformative and it can be done in a matter of a few years. The weak productivity is a huge issue, but I think that we had similar things in the 1930s, and that can be addressed through stronger training. Like, I'd like to see a return to some kind of training levy system, so that big companies, which by and large have failed to invest totally in apprenticeships for decades, are forced to go back to that. That's another thing that was introduced by Attlee, the training boards. They weren't perfect, but at least there was some kind of investment in Britain's labour force. So there you are, quite a few things that can be done.
And you think that McDonnell, because I get the sense that McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn and those around him have the will to walk through the walls that they need to walk through in order to deliver for the people they know they need to deliver on behalf of, which is sort of how I feel the Attlee government was. They just got, Attlee and Co, they got their heads down, and in the teeth of bankruptcy and opposition and a right-wing press, they got down and they went and they went and they went, while there was internal wrangling going on against Attlee at the same time. And I get the feeling that John McDonnell, Corbyn, and those that are close have that same aspiration anyway. We just hope they can keep that fearlessness. Is that a fair comparison?
I think so. I think it's fair to say that Clement Attlee, whilst he wasn't a great man of ideas, he certainly had a team around him, or some in his team, who were great people of ideas. But there was huge division, and time again, from 45 onwards, people saying we can't afford to do this, we can't afford to do that, and yet they did.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big myths that we need to overcome now. And I don't think for a second that John McDonnell buys into this myth. We can't afford to do this. Actually, we cannot afford not to do it. We must go ahead.
So, Cat, in terms of that nationalisation programme, where we're at now, Labour's manifesto now, and they're still working on it because it all came about very quickly, the snap election called. What did you feel when you saw the manifesto? What more can be done? And tell us a little bit about your work, because you do amazing work. So maybe first a bit about that.
Yeah, so We Own It makes the broad case for public ownership, and we've been arguing for a few years now. So I set it up in 2013. I've done campaigning for public transport before that, and I've got frustrated
Can I
about...
interrupt you for a second? Can everybody hear?
No.
Not very well. No. It's not...
I thought I was quite loud.
Yeah.
Stand up. Stand up.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sure. So my background is in public transport campaigning. So I got frustrated at the effect of privatisation on train and bus passengers and how it wasn't working. And when the coalition government came in 2010 and started, privatising the NHS more, obviously we already had the internal market and selling off the Royal Mail. For me, that was a point where I started to join the dots. And I thought that privatisation always led to higher costs, lower quality and less accountability, and that seemed to happen again and again. So I set up We Own It in 2013 to try to make the case for public ownership, but it really felt like we were in the wilderness back then. You know, when we were writing the website and saying, you know, the railway should be in public ownership, energy should be in public ownership, water should be in public ownership. And now, obviously, since June, it's completely taken off because we have a Labour Party with a manifesto that says these things clearly, boldly, unequivocally, that we need rail, energy, water, the Royal Mail in public ownership, that we need to reinstate the NHS, that we need to give local authorities powers to set up their own bus companies. So it was really exciting. It was really, really exciting to see that and to suddenly be able to talk in radio interviews about water and public ownership of water, which we just hadn't had the opportunity to do because it wasn't on the political agenda, and now it is. And now all of the mainstream press is saying, oh, apparently 83% of the public wants public ownership of water, and they've grasped that, and 77% wants public ownership of energy, and 76% want public ownership of the railways, and that's just going up, that support, but it's always been there. Because people haven't bought these myths. So, you know, the inspiration for We Own It was that we've had 30 years of privatisation policies, and actually the public have never supported that. They've never got behind that, despite all we've been told about efficiency and innovation. We know that it's a complete rip-off, and we know that these public services are actually natural monopolies, and you don't get a choice when you're, you know, turning on your tap or getting on the train. You don't get a choice about which provider you have. So the whole market analogy just doesn't really work. It's just a complete scam. So Labour's manifesto, very, very exciting. And I don't know if you want me to talk about this now.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
And spell out a little bit more about the strands of work you do, because you're very clear on what needs to come back, what more we need to do.
Yeah, so we do two things. So we run campaigns on specific issues. So we had a big win recently stopping the privatisation of NHS Professionals, which is the staffing agency that provides staff for hospitals when the NHS needs more capacity. The government were just going to sell it off. So we ran a campaign on that. We also helped to stop the privatisation of the land registry, working with other campaigners. And we also helped to push back plans to privatise Network Rail, the company, which the government was looking at a year and a half ago or so. So we do campaigns. And then we try to shift the debate in that general way. So we try to make the case that public ownership saves money, that it's successful, that it's working in lots of places, that it's worked in this country and abroad. We try to show that privatisation is failing, and we've just released a resource that puts together in one place all of the horror stories that we hear in the press all the time about some of these companies, like Capita, like Serco, like G4S, like Virgin Care. You know, we have horror story after horror story about these companies, and we thought let's collect them all together and show that privatisation is failing again and again and again. So we try to make these arguments in a general sense, and it's really exciting to now be at the point where we're saying, okay, we're talking about public ownership. Instead of talking about whether it's a good idea, let's talk about how we do it. So I went on the Today programme for the first time the other week, and Stephanie Flanders went straight in with pretty brutal questions on, so what about, you know, if you want to bring water companies into public ownership, what about our shares and what about people's pensions? And that was the whole emphasis. But what was exciting about that was, you know, we were talking about how. We were talking about how you might bring water into public ownership rather than whether. And I think it's increasingly coming to light that, you know, the water industry in particular, it's an absolute scandal. So these companies, 1989, they got these companies with zero debt. They've built up a debt mountain of 42 billion. This is complex, leveraged debt. A lot of it involves tax havens. You probably know more about it, John. It's really complicated debt so that they can make as much money as possible. Meanwhile, the actual work of providing water and providing sewerage services, they're not that bothered about. So they pollute our rivers, they kill our fish. There was a scandal with Thames Water releasing lots and lots of sewage straight into the nature reserves and rivers of Oxfordshire. And they get fined, but it makes very little difference because the fines are tiny in comparison to their profits. So they just factor it into their equations. And meanwhile, they're taking a profit of 12% every single year, and that just goes straight to shareholders. And it goes to shareholders in generally in countries elsewhere. So we're basically a revenue stream for them. And it is an absolute scandal. So the Labour manifesto says we'll bring water into public ownership, and that can be done. And whether you compensate shareholders for the money they put in, for something nearer to the market value, or whether you say, do you know what, you've had enough actually. That's a question to be decided. But we're talking about it. Then on the railways, I think there's a really interesting discussion. I feel like I've spent most of my career standing outside railway stations with signs about train fares, and you know, every year, year after year, the train fares go up above inflation, and we talk about it, but now we're saying, okay, actually, this isn't that difficult. We have state-owned railway companies from other European countries running our railways a lot of the time, from France, from Holland, from Italy, from Germany. We could do this ourselves, and what we need to do is just wait for the rail franchises to come up for renewal and then bring them in-house. Now, of course, it's slightly more complicated than that. There's you know, making Network Rail more accountable, linking everything together. You have to think about what to do about the Roscos, which are the companies that own the trains and make a huge profit just from owning and leasing the trains. But basically, all of this stuff can be done, and it makes complete sense. And Labour's saying absolutely the right things on that. Then we have energy, and again, Labour's saying bring it into public ownership. So buying back the national grid and the distribution networks actually pays for itself within about 10 years. So that's what you'd do, and then at the same time you would create more local public energy companies at the local authority level. So you already have Robin Hood Energy in Nottingham, which was the first council-owned energy company, and now there's Bristol Energy too, and these are supply companies that are serving their communities and making sure that bills are affordable, and we could have more of them all across the country. So all of this stuff can be done, and Labour's making all the right noises. I think it is It will be a battle though, obviously internally and externally, and we found, for example, on the NHS, that it's clear that there's internal conflict within Labour, because we've been working with other campaigners to encourage MPs to sign up to a 5-point pledge about reinstating the NHS, building on the work of lots of campaigners for the reinstatement bill. So we've just put that into a little pledge. And we're wondering where Labour is because their MPs aren't signing it yet. So we're kind of knocking on their door and saying, what's the problem? You've just come out against PFI, we need to do this. So I think there are internal battles going on and we need to be cautious about those. But it's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, moving forward to some of the problems. Thank you, Cat. Something you would. So you've got a slightly different perspective on this as a journalist, as a commentator, also somebody who's got very much an international perspective on things. But just a few thoughts, observations, comments on the Labour manifesto generally. Stuff that's of interest to you, stuff that you'd like to see more progress on.
Well, thanks. I mean, I was a last-minute stand-in for Ken Loach, so I'll try not to be too underwhelming. And obviously, my work focuses on Latin America, politics. I'm very interested in media issues, and so some observations. Firstly, on a really fantastic, even visionary talk that I watched by John McDonnell. It was published by Alborada Media, one of these new independent media outlets, and it was titled Governing from the Radical Left, and it was a talk that he gave at the World Transformed, which is the parallel conference organised by Momentum at the recent Labour Party conference. And it was, by all accounts, I didn't make it this year. Last year we had Alborada had a session on Latin America. I didn't make it this year, but by all accounts it was the go-to place. All the sessions were overbooked. Jeremy attended and John. And so I would really recommend watching this 30-minute video where he outlines basically, again, John McDonnell outlines how they are preparing for government. And he talks quite funnily about meetings with the civil service and how the policy team around him are even wargaming scenarios to deal with capital flight. Near the end of that really fascinating talk, he talks about the media and his thoughts on what he calls digital democracy, which for me, I joined the Labour Party after Jeremy won the leadership in 2015. What I feel is the most subversive aspect of the Corbyn project and what the establishment fears the most is this promotion of participation and the sort of promotion of using technology, using new technology. And so John spoke about digital democracy, about the cases in South Korea, about getting people involved in the formulation of policy, and in looking at every possible means to incorporate people in the policy making. So I think that democratic revolution is something that's being, they're putting on the agenda at an intellectual level. So you have the Financial Times writing articles saying that for the first time in 40 years there's an intellectual revolution going on, which I agree. And again, I think this is something that they view as sort of quite scary for them because it's neoliberalism that is being challenged and as an ideology is crumbling. So we have, and when I say establishments, there are obviously the kind of political establishment in the Tories, but what I've seen as a Labour Party member that's joined is that the hegemony of neoliberalism as an ideology has gripped the establishment of Labour in parties where there is no, the famous there is no alternative, Thatcher's mantra became basically, something, a self-fulfilling. People didn't see an alternative and find it very hard to conceive of social democracy. It's viewed as a kind of impossible dream. And so I think that general approach to encouraging participation, encouraging in all areas. I think, interestingly, I'm not an expert but in the terms of the economy, I think again it's not just about going back to nationalisation, because as we know, there were great problems of associated with state-run, and we have technology now, and I think the new team around Jeremy and around John are very kind of open to looking at how technology, how we can make new forms of ownership dynamic, creative, and to learn the lessons from the errors or the inadequacies of old state-centered systems. So in the realm of the media, I mean, these are some just observations in no particular order. I recently attended a conference of Independent Media Network, a new network where you had people like Alborada Media who have, for people accessing information, increasingly so, especially the young online, and Facebook is now one of the main forms in which young people access information. These are the new media outlets which are breaking the hegemony or the stranglehold of that neoliberal voice that kind of sort of says there is no alternative in every sphere, that same voice that denigrates and smears Corbyn and has done it
Definitely Flanders, maybe. I don't think
Exactly,
that's what they'll go to immediately, that framework.
Yeah, and I think, and this is where I guess the work I've looked at in Latin America is interesting. My own family history, my parents are, my father's here, my parents are political exiles from the, after the coup against Allende, the Pinochet coup, which is actually the birth of neoliberalism, and people forget that the system that rules today wasn't capitalism and freedom, as Milton Friedman liked to write about. It was actually fascism, torture. So it's an ideology, it's a system that is born through blood, and I think there is a direct connection between the flames of the burning Moneda Palace against Allende and the Grenfell flames, because this is an ideology which prioritizes profit over people and is really quite merciless when it comes to making sure that happens. So I think the great thing about the Corbyn project and its participation, and it's seeing young people enthusiastic. In terms of media, I think there have been failings, I would say, from those around Corbyn in really grasping how to mobilise that. I think those around him have seen, especially with the election, how quite independently run initiatives, how successful they were, whether it be in the cultural realm. There was a Grime for Corbyn movement of young people in the estates that mobilised young people to initially register for vote in massive numbers. And then those new people voted for Corbyn in disproportionately large numbers. So I think John McDonnell, in that speech that I was talking about, is aware of how important that social media, that new media aspect is to talk directly to new people, to try and avoid as much as possible, and not obviously boycott the traditional media, but be aware that they're not going to get a fair deal from that, and try to look for new forms. And the most interesting thing for me is that they talk about how to then increase engagement. So not only to reach new people, but how do we go from consciousness raising, if you want, to actual engagement using new media. So.
Thank you.
I want to make a couple of comments, but first of all I want to mention something. My mother died last Saturday, age 99, don't go that way.
99!
She was a German Jewish refugee to this country, actually came here through a visa organised by Herbert Morrison. I was a next door neighbour, Harold Wilson, and knew Clement Attlee very well. Joined the army in 1941 and was with the Army Education Corps, and was one of those people in the film who was teaching officers and corps about the Beveridge Report. And she remained a lifelong socialist until she lost her mind just a couple of years ago. But she thought all along that Blair's project was a project of cowardice, a complete capitulation at every single stage of everything that we should be standing for. And she saw it very early on. And above all, she said, this buying into the neoliberalism will destroy everything that we stood for back in 1945, the post-war dream, because she recognised that capitalism would absolutely take no prisoners whatsoever about this. So a little bit of tribute to my mum and so on. But the point I wanted to make about the water companies and so on, and the water companies are such a brilliant and yet stupid example. You mentioned, Cat, about how they've been laden with debt. This is the way in which capitalism has transformed. The gentleman there asked in the earlier session, let's understand capitalism. Well, somehow through the 1970s and 80s, they managed to get one tax break after another. And the biggest tax break, of course, was to have absolutely unlimited tax relief on interest payments. And what did that do? It quite simply meant that they would borrow up to the hilt, typically through offshore treasury holdings, shift all their profits offshore, as the water companies have been doing forever. You see, I've had a 5-year battle with the the Consumer Council about precisely this, and it seems to me that they are absolutely useless. They don't understand. The profits that these companies are making are astonishingly high, but they're disguised by the way in which they're able to charge, for example, astonishing internal rates. They're charging themselves huge rates of interest. Why do they do that? Precisely to shift their profits offshore. And of course, once they're offshore in the Channel Islands or whatever, they're untaxed. And that's why capitalism has been accumulating such huge amounts of uninvested wealth. They're not going to invest it because there is sufficient demand in the economy. So there it is, sitting there doing nothing useful whatsoever. We've actually transformed our economy. Britain, I think, is possibly the worst, into what in the 19th century was called a rent-seeking economy. And to understand this transformation from capitalism, where they're actually investing in productive activities, as once they did, to a rent-seeking economy, you have to see that that was the Tory project all the way through. They were never really interested in entrepreneurial capitalism. They were always landed gentry and city people interested in how can we skim and scam, how can we buy up the profit-making opportunities, shift them offshore and not pay any tax on it. And that's where we are at the moment. And we need to break that entirely, because they've got no interest whatsoever in having a competitive entrepreneurial economy. They're not that type of people. There's nothing. And you contrast that with the German economy, you see an astonishing difference, even though the Germans going more in that direction now. But and I think
in what way? Oh,
the astonishing, the Germans, first of all, they didn't have the huge overarching banks until Deutsche Bank started becoming Deutsche Bank moved to Britain and actually became more offshore. They had a banking system that was more rooted in the local economy. In other words, a bit like our building societies of old. They soaked up local savings and reinvested those local savings in the domestic economy, in the local economy. I remember in the 1970s I had a long talk with the board of BMW. I'd just been speaking to what was then Norton Villiers' triumph as the British motorcycle industry collapsed. And they said, well, the real problem we face in Britain is our banks won't lend us any money at all. It takes 7 years to go through a product cycle, and our banks only think in 2 to 3 years, and they're very risk averse. The cost of capital is astonishing in this country. Go to BMW, they're about to bring out an entirely new range of motorcycles, and they're saying, well, our bank's been on the board, it's a local bank, it's been on the board since 1912 when we were formed. They understand our business model perfectly. We have a long-term relationship management, banking, banker sitting, and this same person's been on the board for 20 years now. Now that has never happened in Britain. We abandoned relationship management in the 1970s.
Never had it.
Never really had it, I think you're probably right. And certainly no interest in industrial capitalism. Financial capitalism always came. And it's never actually wanted to be involved in investing in Britain.
So just to move it on a bit, and to look at obstacles, and you're talking about the skimming off, completely different, a sort of an anti-entrepreneurial capitalism agenda. They have a much more basic agenda. I just want to come back to Attlee and something that's in your Spider's Web film. He said, I think this was during the 40s, over and over again, we have seen that there is in this country another power than that which has its seat at Westminster. The City of London, a convenient term for a collection of financial interests, is able to assert itself against the government of the country. Those who control money can pursue a policy at home and abroad, contrary to that which is being decided by the people. That's Clement Attlee in the 1940s.
He got it, he understood it, and he wasn't the first, but he certainly understood the constraints that the city could impose. Sadly, they nationalised the Bank of England, but they never actually we've
Got
never
to grips.
really had a proper central bank under proper government control. And now we have a central bank, well, not a central bank, Bank of England by and large, and again, Gordon Brown's unforgivable. I mean, everyone thought it was a brilliant coup at the time to give them that degree of autonomy. No, they are not an independent bank in that they have a clear instruction from the state to pursue an anti-inflationary policy, and they're given a target which they have to work around, blah blah blah. So the idea that it's autonomous is nonsense. But why did we just choose to target inflation? Because the Fed has always been told it's inflation and unemployment. So a political decision was made there, and New Labour washed their hands off the central bank's key roles and didn't really define what the key roles should be. There's that issue. But I think that we also need to understand that far from being a golden goose, the City of London has actually imposed upon Britain a kind of state within a state, a politics where they actually determine what our core economic policy will be. And as an economist, let me just tell you that economists are shockingly bad about this. They all buy into this argument, which you'll hear on the Today programme every flipping day. So I've listened to it since I was 18. So 42 years or 43 years I've listened to the Today programme and heard, but yes, Minister, but the markets won't allow this to happen. Now, who are these markets? It's the bankers. If you try to do this, the bankers will leave. HSBC forced George Osborne to not go ahead with to bring down the upper marginal rates of tax, and to not go ahead with regulation, and to abandon the idea of a financial transaction tax by saying they would go if Osborne went ahead with that, which he didn't really want to do anyway, but Alistair Darling had floated it, then they would leave to Hong Kong. Our response was to send a limousine round to HSBC saying, here's the car to the airport, go.
Yes.
We'd be far better off without you. And I think we need to have the courage, and I know John McDonnell does have the courage, to say the City of London actually undermines the UK economy. It has determined our exchange rate policy for decades to the detriment of the productive economy, and we now need to reverse that.
Cat, obstacles. So we know there's a majority across the country for renationalising, bringing back into public ownership. Where are the voices of opposition, as you see them? Obviously, private companies.
I'd like to also come back on.
Yes,
I thought of a couple of things we put in our manifesto that Labour didn't have in its manifesto, but I know that they're working on. And this is a slight tangent, but I'll come back to your question because it also relates to what Pablo said. The tech companies, the global tech companies. So when we're thinking about public ownership and what we want from public ownership, there's always this framework of renationalising, and that's always the word that people use. We never use that word because we can't go back. We can't go back to the 1970s. We should build on what we had. We should celebrate what we had. We should make it better. We can't go back. We have to go forwards, and we have to create something that's better and stronger than we had in the past. And I think that's really important. And when we're telling that story about how this is the public ownership of the future, we also need to look at the other public services that are appearing in our economy. And I think there's a couple of key examples, and they're both to do with these giant tech companies. So one of them is driverless cars. Sounds like something a bit out of sci-fi, and I think most people think it is, but it's very much happening. They're going to be on our streets from 2019. The tech companies are basically investing in this rather than the traditional car companies. And what they see is that we'll have self-driving electric vehicles, and that will completely transform the way that transport works in our cities and in the countryside. It has huge potential to get cars out of our cities, to enable everybody to be able to have mobility and buy mobility as a service. So you'll go on your smartphone and you'll order your driverless car and it will pop up at your door. But at the moment, all of that innovation is being discussed and being led by industry. And what we actually need to do is say, look, if you want to use our roads, our public roads and our public infrastructure then you need to play by our rules. You know, so when we're thinking about the legislation around this and all of the regimes around this, how this is going to work, we need to think about reining in those tech companies and making this work for people rather than profit. So yes, it's a brand new public service, driverless cars, but it's going to happen. So do we want it to work for those tech companies, or do we want it to work for us? Another area which is all about tech is social media and the internet. And the internet is obviously, right now, it's a bit like a Wild West. But there are monopolies cropping up in what ideally should be a public space online where we can all share ideas, we can all communicate. But right now it's not a public space. It's a space that is led by a handful of tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, and these companies get to decide the rules of the game. We don't get to decide them. So, for example, when we I shared a video earlier today on our Facebook page about the support for public ownership and how much that's grown. And I had to boost it, because although we've got 23,000 followers, Facebook won't let them see our content anymore unless we boost it. So I had to spend £100 to reach 15,000 to 39,000 people. Now, a few weeks ago, £100 would have reached up to 150,000 people. That's our business model, but our business model is our campaigning model. And we're a tiny organisation, we don't have the resources to spend that money to reach people. So the companies that are controlling our channels of communication online, where we're spending our time, we have to rein them in as well. And I think it's really important that Labour start to talk about that too.
That's huge, yes.
I'd like to make a big comment about this, because again, getting back to the gentleman who spoke earlier about the way in which capitalism has transformed, one of the key ways, and this is actually why I was in Luxembourg, I was discussing this with the World Bank and the EIB and so on. One of the ways is to transform what they call the value creation, or the value chain, to a chain in which intellectual property rights dominate. And over the course of the last 50, 60 years, we've seen an astonishing laxity come in, so that copyrights are extended more and for longer and longer. Patents, which used to be quite time limited, are now heading up into very lengthy periods.
Back to rent seeking.
More rent seeking, precisely. And I think that if we now need to open up a global debate, because my view is patents, give them 3 years to 5 max. Max.
Yep.
And then you'll start breaking the apples and the apples and all the rest of it. Because actually, in the case of Apple and so on, they're all working on the backs of massive state investment in the World Wide Web and massive state investment in all the technologies that lie at the core of our smartphones. Most of the technologies are in MIT, US defense spending. So, you know, I think we now need to open up a much wider discussion.
Oh my God,
about
Theresa May.
I was going to go that way, about whether or not it's in the public interest to allow these monopolies to have these controls over intellectual property rights. Contentiously, I would say, I think we should give maximum 3 to 5 years in this maximum. If you can't...
Can you do that in one country?
Don't see why not. Apart from the fact we've tied ourselves into all sorts of international agreements, but they were bad international agreements. Walk away from them. Or push heavily against them. We need to push back. We need to make the intellectual case now for pushing back against them.
Just a quick observation on what Cat was saying about Facebook and how they're effectively putting more and more barriers, financial barriers to entry to even access your followers on Facebook, to even access them, which is absolutely true. That the majority won't see what you actually post. But I think there's an even more sinister development that's taken place over the summer when Google changed its algorithm and how it allows people to access websites, basically, and it was done in response to the New York Times and the Washington Post and a movement that has that's been promoted by establishment media outlets. Ostensibly, they argue that it's in the wake of Trump, and they use fake news, what they say fake news, as the reason. That they have been lobbying and pressuring Google and Facebook to crack down on fake news outlets. What that has meant in practice is that independent media outlets, based on the internet, have seen a massive drop in traffic. So what we seem to be seeing from the evidence, there was a recent article outlining how Alternet, an independent website, had seen a 50% drop, and a range of independent outlets are seeing big drops in people accessing their website. So we're seeing how this threat of a kind of terrain that can't be controlled, that in the British case is allowing young people to access new websites, hear counter-hegemonic discourses that that kind of challenge the sort of prevailing orthodoxy around Corbyn, around neoliberalism. There is a movement that seems to be saying, okay, it's and using fake news. When you have the Washington Post, which has Google, that has CIA involvement in its shareholders, who promoted the Iraq war, that sold us the lies around WMDs, that led to the death of a million Iraqis. When you have these type of organizations being those that determine who are the promoters of fake news, and colluding and working with tech giants that have the power to control what you see and what you don't see, I think it's a very alarming and serious development that not enough people on the left or in progressive circles are really cottoning onto. And I think the Corbyn government, as well as having to engage with the media reform coalitions, their report on the concentration of large media and the need for plurality, and how to challenge this idea that rich people owning private media is somehow, we can conflate that with freedom of expression, which is nothing could be further from the truth. Rich people with right-wing views owning large parts of the media is not freedom of expression. It's actually a challenge and an attack on democracy. So, but we've been conflated we've been conditioned to conflate those two things. So I think I just wanted to make this sinister development. I think we're going to see an increasing attack on these kind of spaces that challenge dominant narrative.
This lady's dying to say something.
I just wanted to give an example of the experiences. Just a really quick example. Then I've got a question for this gentleman here. But I wanted to give a really quick example of the whole change in ethos from the politics that I kind of knew. Because
Can you speak up, please?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Stand up and speak.
Oh, right. I can't stand for very long, so I'll just turn round. Can you hear me at the back now?
Wonderful.
No, I just wanted to give a very quick example of my experience of the Corbyn government before I asked this gentleman a question. But I was at the Labour Party conference, and I'm mobility challenged, and I have various other disabilities, including hearing. And it was not an accessible experience, and it was not a pleasurable experience at all. I had a lot of trouble with getting taxis to come to the disabled spot. I was in quite a lot of very, very severe pain from standing and from walking for quite a long period of time, because the scooter was only available inside the buildings. It wasn't available and well transformed, and it was generally a very inaccessible conference. And I'm also part of a group called Party Participation and Disabled People, who are lobbying to have greater accessibility for disabled people within the Labour Party itself. We formed a collective, and we're doing some lobbying and campaigning work, and I managed to give a leaflet about our work to John McDonnell. And it was late. He was coming out of a concert. He may have had a drink or two, and I thought, well, what's the harm in giving him a leaflet? And then I went to a very tiny community event in North London a week later, and who was there but the local MP? And I was trying to thinking, do I bother him? He's the leader of the party. Do I bother him with this issue? And I was, he said, what did you want to say? And I'm like, oh no, it can wait. And then eventually, as I saw him leaving, I just sort of blurted out, Jeremy had a terrible experience at conference. The conference was not accessible. The party is not accessible, and the things need to be. And then he sort of stopped me and he said, "Do you know what? John's already told me about the leaflet you gave him last week, and we've already tabled a motion for the NEC." I nearly died of a heart attack, because basically it meant that within the space of a week, the two men spoke to each other and decided it was a serious enough issue to table a motion at the NEC. Yeah. And I had a tiny little part in that. And obviously a lot of us had a lot of bad experiences with accessibility, so it wasn't just me who put that forward. There was a lot of us who suffered as a result of the inaccessibility. But it just the sort of sense of do I bother the leader with this issue, and him already knowing about it, literally had palpitations. Question for this gentleman was there's legislation was passed a while ago that enabled the government and government agencies to spy on our internet browsing history, DWP and organisations like that. And there's something you can subscribe to called a VPN, which I've told my friends about, which basically makes your browsing history private. But my question, I'm trying to remember my question.
Well, do you know what? Maybe we could save it because we've got a few more bits to carry on with, and we're going to open up to a quick Q&A. Is that all right? You can come back to that question.
Yeah, but I have short-term memory problems from too slow.
Okay.
Yeah,
well done.
The Snoopers Charter, it's colloquially known as the Snoopers Charter, and a VPN. I'll come back to it later.
We'll come back. We'll open it up to Q&A. We're not quite there yet. We're nearly there. Yeah?
Yeah. It was
but anyway, what the point you're proving is what Pablo was talking about earlier, which is accessibility and the willingness to sort of be open to all comers with all ideas to feed in. I just wanted to come back quickly to Cat and just this idea of opposition to nationalisation or public ownership.
Yeah.
What's your feel, given that we know the public majority is there?
Yeah, the public majority is absolutely there, and I think, but it's interesting to see how the debate developed, because I think, you know, the right wing is panicking right now, and we've seen, especially the water industry, but you know, across the board we're seeing, you know, the fact that the Financial Times is questioning the water industry is obviously terrifying to the water companies, the shareholders, Ofwat, you know, and that fear I think is felt in general. You know, the rail industry have had their line for a while, so they're maybe more used to it. But this is just, you know, catapulted up the political agenda. So I think they're really afraid, and I think we have to think about the language that they're coming out with and how we can counter that, and also where there might be a point and where they don't have a point. So you said earlier about, you know, we don't have to say that things were always perfect before, but we can talk about building on what worked before and making it better. And I think that's really important to get right. So we have to make it clear that we're the future, not them, and that means making public ownership better. So, you know, involving communities more, involving the public more, having more transparency, more accountability. And there's lots of examples we can use for that in terms of, you know, good practice. And I think we also need to be clear about the fact that we can think about, you know, how do we build publicly owned organisations that have great culture, great management, great incentives that people really want to work, you know, get the most of. Yeah.
I mean, that's very interesting, because if you think that we've had 40 years of a mindset, of a generation and a half coming through with a certain mindset. I remember we did a screening of a film called Inside Job a long time ago, and there was a young person in the front row, and we were talking about economics, and they said, well, I can't remember where they were studying economics at university, and because the entire university economics department was of a certain neoliberal, they had ended up doing, God forbid, development economics. In other words, the international take on economy and looking at how the global north relates to the global south. Well, if that's all you're left to do, to go for a left analysis in terms of economics, is to do development economics, and God knows the global south has enough on its plate without, you know, shed loads of students in the UK thinking, well, there's nowhere else for me to go. In terms of the new culture coming in, we have Labour, we know what the project is, we know what they would aspire to. How do you get to grips with all of that mindset shift that needs to happen in order that these newly revived industry sectors can actually deliver? Because one of the things that's come through for me this day, is that there were problems. Of course, there were problems in the 40s in terms of mindsets. People that were put in to run nationalised industries, old guard, old mindsets. You've got this tension going on there.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I think we have to have a big conversation about it, and I think it should be a public conversation. So we're just about to launch actually a kind of YouTube series to talk about this, to try and say, okay, what's the path to public ownership? What does that look like? And kind of dig into some of these questions and talk to people in lots of different sectors about how it could work in practice. So, because actually, you know, possibly an element of what has sometimes been missing in the past is to have that real public involvement and that real sense of public involvement. And so, for example, I'm doing a response to a New Statesman piece at the moment, and their criticisms, I can't remember who the guy is, I've forgotten, Gregory, someone. Anyway, they said British Rail was underinvested in, and that was their main criticism. So that's absolutely right. How do we make sure that it's properly invested in, and how do we make sure that the investment is for, you know, new green technology, and how do we make the public feel part of that and passengers feel part of that? It's all completely possible, but we need to have a conversation about it.
Who will you have the conversation with?
Good.
I mean, I hear you what you say about technology, and a lot of us have to come to grips with technology. But you're talking about all these things on the internet, Apple, and different things. Does this get out to the masses? I mean, you mentioned the Financial Times.
Yeah.
Who buys the Financial Times now? Not the ordinary working class. And the working class papers are cracked, as you well know. No, seriously.
Actually, could I just say that? I think the first thing is actually it's the competition. So it's just a competition for people's minds, how people think. So all the ideas follow, and really they've encouraged people to become undereducated, to not be able to articulate anything. So what they've done is turn people back into, you know, someone that can't really have a dialogue. And I think, you know, that's the thing with the new technology, is it is encouraging that dialogue. And it is worrying when you think that that's being closed down, because obviously they realise the revolutionary principle of dialogue. You know, hence, you know.
Yeah, just on that issue, I think they've encouraged people to become lazy. So people know that public ownership is a good idea in their heart of hearts, but people don't necessarily feel confident in it. They don't feel that they necessarily understand the arguments, either because they feel like it's an area of economics and they're not confident in it, or because maybe they're too young to remember what happened before, so they don't feel that it's possible, and that's what you know today is all about. But I think it's about building that confidence with people who feel that this is right, but they need to be able to put that across more.
And could I just ask
I remember one question. Okay, 1 second,
This is to do with economics and people going broke. You know, with local authorities need to do things, and they say, well, we haven't got any money, we have to make these cuts. Well, I quite honestly don't believe that. I think that we have to go on. It's like all the building that is going on in our cities, and I said it before, they're lying empty and they should be occupied by homeless families or families in need. But I find it very difficult when a local council says, no, you can't have that, we haven't got the money. And they've got money, they must have money, they get our rates.
You're quite right. One of the biggest problems facing local councils is the Treasury. And our Treasury, at least as long as I've been around, and I'm a former Treasury person myself, doesn't have the mindset of the 1970s or 1960s, it has the mindset of the 19th century. It's very liberal and very conservative, and they have blocked councils from borrowing money. Now, councils can borrow money at a very, very cheap rate.
Yeah.
They are able to issue bonds. If you want to invest in new housing, councils can borrow the money to do it. The Treasury is blocking it from doing that. And that's one of the things we need to tackle as quickly as possible. The Treasury have also been cut back deliberately by the government, so the government restricts their ability to raise taxes locally. That must end as quickly as possible. More generally, you know, the attitude here is that the Treasury controls absolutely everything within our country, operating within a neoliberal mindset, which frankly is 19th century thinking. We haven't moved on. There was a brief period between 1945 and maybe the early 1970s when Keynesianism was adopted right the way through our economy, and local councils were encouraged to and able to go ahead with the project. We need to free local councils and local democracy to do more of that.
Okay, I have two questions for Pablo.
Can I just one second?
This lady was able to ask a
Okay, go ahead.
This lady was able to ask a question. Why am I not?
Well, because I thought we might wrap up this conversation here in 5 minutes and then have 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes Q&A.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so you all right? You remember the question,
Yeah.
that's fine.
VPNs, what is your opinion of them? And the other question was, with regard to Venezuela, that's being kind of held up by...
We don't want to hear about that.
Oh, you
No,
don't want
not
to hear about
interested
it?
in
Okay, all right. Well, what's your opinion of a VPNs in terms of effectiveness?
I don't know enough about them, but I've heard that yes, there is a way to hide your internet browsing, and I think along with a range of measures, I would hope that the Corbyn and the McDonnell government can look at these what seem to be sort of quite serious attacks on alternative media, that they legislate in favour of promoting independent media, that they also deal with legislating for having a regulatory body with teeth, proper regulatory body, that they help democratise the media ownership. Because I think ultimately the conversation we're having, whether it be in the economy, whether it be in the media, it's about democracy. And it's about neoliberalism being a system that is completely against democracy, that closes spaces, that closes participation, that privatises profits, that socialises debt, that enforces violence against new vision, social democracy, you want to call it, you can call it socialism, that seeks to open up participation, a plurality of voices, and now obviously with the technology we have the chance and the ability to improve on some of the systems that have been created in the past in the name of socialism, and I think that's the challenge that we have. I was fortunate enough to study economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies I graduated in 2000, a kind of dissident space of economics, probably in the world, but certainly inside job, you've had economic students around the world come together to protest the economics, and I understand, I've done courses at the LSE where you have the future Chicago boys, future Latin American finance, and literally they're indoctrinated by which if you study it, it's absolutely ludicrous. If you study, I would say the most revolutionary thing we could do is to teach neoliberalism theory to everyone through political education, because the theory is absolutely ludicrous. You have to think, you have to believe a set of assumptions which have no basis in the real world. And so anyone that understands what neoliberalism means in theory knows that in practice it's a fraud. So I think that's,
And this has been a really long time coming. I mean, I don't know if you've already talked about the Mont Pelerin Society, but as soon as the NHS was created, there was this group of right-wing economists who thought, how can we get back the agenda? How can we do that? How can we reclaim the agenda on behalf of neoliberalism? And that was back in 1947, I think they met for the first time. And then they obviously created think tanks across the world, and they used those think tanks which had money to promote their ideas, to the point where we are today, where we've been indoctrinated with this stuff that is clearly ridiculous, like the idea that the private sector is somehow inherently more efficient. And it's just not true, and we pay more in various ways when we privatise. But we've got all those mantras in our head that have been, forced there.
Brainwashed, yeah. So, before we just come quickly to a Q&A then, how frightening is Corbyn and McDonnell in reality to the Conservatives, certainly, to all these sorts of vested interests we're talking about, as well as, I'm guessing, certain bits within the Labour Party itself who just don't maybe see, who have maybe drunk the neoliberal Kool-Aid. How, just one by one, just how, I'm sure if you're sitting in the city, you'd love to see John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn just drink something, just go away, because what they represent is so relative to where we've come over the past 70 years, radical. As I said this morning, if you were to read the 1945 manifesto, it would really make Jeremy Corbyn look like a Lib Dem, kind of, almost, really. That's how far the goalposts have been moved. They, of course, understand that. So, just one by one, how frightening are they to the other side?
I think we can put a figure of it, 14 pages. That's how much the Daily Mail published in June. It's very frightening indeed, because they know that the ideas that were being promoted by von Hayek and Friedman when they met in Montpellier, those ideas are now utterly discredited. The entire intellectual underpinning of economic conservatism or economic liberalism or the Chicago Boys or whatever you want to call it, ex-LSE, so LSE is poison and they haven't moved on, is gone. I would like to promote in 2 weeks' time in Edinburgh there'll be the meeting at the International Network for New Economic Thinking, and a lot of young people have rejected entirely the underpinnings of economic thinking in most of our faculties in Britain. So things are moving on fast. But I think it's very frightening indeed, above all to the city interests, because Brexit, they weren't expecting Brexit. And Brexit has opened up a complete can of worms. I'm happy to talk about that at length in Q&A if you want to go down that route. But I think the answer is very threatening indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, in a sense, it's in the tradition of mainstream European social democracy, what they're talking about. It's not actually wildly radical. We're talking about a mixed economy, not having the private sector doing everything. We're not actually talking, although some people are getting excited on Twitter about nationalising Greggs, nationalising Wetherspoons, etc., etc. We're actually talking about a mixed economy and public services being public and letting the private sector do its thing in other areas. But I think, as you say, John, it kind of takes the bottom out of the whole intellectual underpinning of what's been going on, and in a way, I mean, this is why I got into campaigning on public ownership, because it seemed like a weak spot. It seemed like a bit where it all starts to fall apart, because if you take the ideology that far, it all starts to unravel, and you think, actually, what the hell is going on here? So I think they know that it's a weak spot, and that's why they're so scared. It's opening up new conversations that haven't been had before, and the Overton window is the range of acceptable debate has shifted, and that's terrifying because they don't know how far it will go.
I think the establishment are absolutely petrified, and see Corbyn and McDonnell as an immense threat. I think to have someone like Corbyn as the leader of the biggest social democratic party in Europe, and as a leader of the British state, is a major threat to establishment elites. I think correctly that what they see as a major part of that threat is how this movement has energized sectors of society that have for a long time now basically looked at politics and said thanks but no thanks, they're all the same. Has engaged with cultural movements in the equivalent to the barrios of Britain, in the way that successful left-wing movements did in Latin America. And I think that this kind of coming together of the previously excluded and exploited by the system, who are now engaging in favour of Corbyn, is a massive threat. And if you look at the Chilean case and what happened under Salvador Allende, and how the media, El Mercurio, which is the oldest media outlet in Latin America, was at the forefront of the campaign to firstly prevent Allende from assuming, but once he did, along with the CIA and along with the domestic elites, waged a war. They were at the forefront of regime change with Corbyn. And I think the other threat is that they've thrown pretty much everything at him. So they tried to denigrate him, to ridicule him. If you look at the reports by the LSE and Loughborough, and there's there are people that contest the fact that Corbyn's had a bad, the media have been unfair to him. But I think if you look at serious reports, looking at content analysis, you're not really kind of plausibly going to be arguing that Corbyn hasn't been the subject to quite an intense campaign of vilification. So they've thrown everything at him, and we are where we are, where he's, on the brink possibly of being the Prime Minister at the next election. So I think all this together, presents a very major threat, and I think I wouldn't underestimate what those opposed to Corbyn will do if he gets to power, and the media will be at the forefront of that campaign.
We'll open up for Q&A now, but I just have to read this on that note. I'm back to Clement.
Really?
James Margach, a lobby correspondent from the 1940s to the 1970s, said, I have never known the press so consistently and irresponsibly political, slanted and prejudiced as during the years of the Attlee government. The Prime Minister himself was a figure of fun in the press throughout his 6 years. If it did not upset him, it upset his colleagues. Herbert Morrison, Peter Mandelson's grandfather, as you'll know, began his day with the press cuttings, and he always wrote or telephoned if he didn't like what he saw. As early as 1946, the Attorney General was attacking the campaign of calumny and misrepresentation which the Tory party and Tory stooge press had directed at the Labour government. Freedom of the press does not mean freedom to tell lies. And in October 1946, which I didn't know, Parliament set up a royal commission on the press, which eventually forced the Press Council on the industry. So that goes back to Attlee. Q&A for how long? Yes.
I was so inspired by seeing that film actually again.
Spirit of 45.
Spirit of 45. But there was one subject that was not discussed in that film, which was Attlee's more questionable record on foreign policy.
Yes, yeah.
You know, he presided over
India.
a terrible conflagration in India. He didn't do much to protect the Palestinians when they withdrew from Palestine in 1948. Things like this.
Yeah.
Now, this is a discussion, I think, about the Labour government that is coming. You know, where do they stand on issues like supplying arms to Saudi Arabia? Where do they stand on you know, where do they stand on the whole issue of our relationship with Europe, which I'm so glad you finally raised, because that is the real elephant in the room, I think.
I mean, on foreign policy, when we were preparing the research for this, and we focused on domestic primarily, it was not because we didn't want to flow in all of the questions around foreign policy in the Attlee government, but it's a whole body of work in itself. And I had some revelatory moments when especially with this being partition year, Attlee had not intended partition. I don't know how long we've got, and it's a big conversation, but the original idea in 1946?
48. It's 48.
But I'm talking 46.
Yeah,
partition.
The
We're
idea
talking
was to have
partition 47.
48 instead of 47.
This year, 70 years.
Yeah.
2 years before, immediately after the election, I think he sent off, who was foreign, Staff Cripps to India, get everybody together, conference, and their offer, Attlee's offer, was self-determination, self-rule for majority Muslim regions. To everybody's surprise, Jinnah, who was leading for the Muslim population in India, agreed, and the Congress Party, Gandhi and Nehru said no. Attlee said, bring them back, let's bash heads together. Because what Labour was suggesting was that Muslim self-rule on everything but defence and security. Foreign policy and security. And the Congress Party was saying, no, we can't have this kind of separation, not good enough. They all come to London. I think it's important. I'm glad you've raised this, because partition is a big old cloud that hangs over.
But I'm more interested in what's going to happen in the future.
But it's important because it hangs over Attlee, and all I'm saying is a slightly more complicated. Anyway, foreign policy next year. But it was Attlee's hope always that India could stay together.
Was the film a response to Brexit? Because I'm seeing...
This film, Spirit of 45.
When was it made?
It's 3 or 4 years, I think, 2013.
Because it seems to have a resonance with Brexit and rebuilding. And,
oh, interesting. Okay, so I don't know if you want to hold these questions in your mind. So what was your question? So foreign policy was your question, and Brexit, and then the gentleman behind, and then you. Yeah.
Psychopolitics. Question about psychopolitics. Your comment about the new economic thinking, that used to be called post-autistic economics.
Yes.
The idea was, coming out of Paris, that this mechanistic view of the economy arose from a state of mind that was quasi-autistic and paralleled many other quasi-autistic scientistic ways of thinking. There's a real problem there about the state of mind. that's underlying any concrete action in the world. And last, connected with that, if our state of mind, we on the good guys, if we gee ourselves up to confront the demon, we're not going to be able to split the opposition, find who we can use as our allies and turn against the ones we can't.
Does anybody understand that? Because
No.
I don't know enough to know what you're talking about, but I'm hoping somebody here.
Can I first of all pick up on why it was called post-autistic? Because actually I was involved with that Sorbonne group, and it came out of Sorbonne when a whole load of students, in the context of the 1997-98 Far East Asian crisis, walked out of their economic session saying, A, economics has become totally asocial or antisocial. It has removed itself from any connection with real society.
With humanity.
Secondly, it has a rather it has a degree of contempt for society. In other words, Homo economicus in reality does not conform to our models, so they must adapt to our models, not the other way around. And thirdly, they're driven by mathematics and mathematics, their thinking is entirely mathematics. And these are symptoms of some kinds of autism. I know because I work with autism in another area. And the problem is that neoliberal modelling has become the common sense. Cat's talking about, it's common sense that the private sector is more efficient, without actually questioning what does efficiency mean.
So the enemy is not necessarily neoliberalism, but pervasive endemic sub-autism.
Well, it actually goes, up to a point, but it goes back to the 19th century. Sorry, I don't want to get too involved in the economics thinking. Marshall, the Cambridge economist, was trying to counter Marx with an entirely different view of how economies work and make it mathematical. And in doing that, paid no attention to human beings.
Just so I don't forget, you're 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Two quick observations. So one, absolutely, I think that what we're talking about is the kind of neoliberals that view the economy as biology, and that's the danger, where they kind of think that it's that plus that equals that, and if it doesn't, that humans have to there's an equation and it works, and if it doesn't work, it's because humans are not doing what they should do, and humans will be taught by fair or foul means to fit into that equation to get the that they want. Just a very quick observation on foreign policy, not to go into it, but at the end of the just before Labour left power last time, I just want to give an example of how Labour Party got corrupted when it comes to foreign policy. There was an NGO funded by the British trade union movement that funds to a large degree the Labour Party, working on the issue of trade union deaths in Colombia, the country that had more trade unionists killed per year than all of the rest of the countries in the world put together. Labour were in power, and Labour were providing secret military aid to a far-right government, the Uribe government, that was presiding over the killing of the most amount of trade unions. So on the one hand, the Labour movement was funding the organisation that was documenting these killings, and the Labour Party was providing diplomatic, financial, secret military aid to a fascist, basically, far-right government presiding over mass killings of trade unionists. So that just kind of puts out where Labour got to in the deformation of foreign policy. And to say that being in power doesn't mean being in government. If you can be the leader of the Labour Party, doesn't mean you have control of the Labour Party. You would see that if you look at how certain Labour people spoke about trying to challenge Labour's policy, because it was a policy that aligned with the US and the special relationship, and how the civil service, basically, there is a kind of wiggle room over policy, but there are some issues that transcend governments, and if you go up against that, then there is a kind of deeper state, some people call it, that kicks in. So I think that's interesting.
Before, because John wanted to mention something about Brexit, is that right?
Yeah, well, you rightly said it's an elephant in the room here, and I can see where you're coming from when you say the film, kind of huge confusion around it. It does seem to me, I'll be honest, I'm open about this, I align with Yanis Varoufakis in his position on Brexit, which was better to be at the table, better to be in a position where we had some degree of say in this, even though the European Union is a massive...
We?
Sorry?
Who's we? It's not us. It's not us at the table,
UK
is
government.
it?
UK
Yeah,
government.
exactly.
But and it does seem to me that the Labour Party could now and should have, and I don't know enough about what they're doing within Europe, rebuild through the Socialist International or the Social Democratic groupings, rebuild relationships with potential allies right the way across Europe and come forward with a vision of what an alternative Europe might be. Because we're in a bit of a mess here, aren't we? Over whether or not we want to be single market.
We'll be in less of a position to do that.
Yes.
No.
I think we need to do that as quickly as possible and start building alliances, because we have plenty of friends in Nordic countries and in Central and Eastern Europe, and of course in Spain, Italy and elsewhere, who would like to have us involved in starting to create a new vision for what Europe might be, rather than what it is.
There's a very patient gentleman here, and then there, and there, yes.
Yeah, I actually did want to ask about Brexit all this time, and now it's been brought up. But I mean, it seems to me there are two aspects. First of all, clearly it is going to cause an economic hit to a greater or lesser extent, and how much impact is that going to have on a Corbyn government's ability to deliver the programme that it wants to in terms of public investment and social care. Secondly, the issues that you've spoken about regarding sort of tax avoidance and globalisation and the ability of capital to move around the world. That is something that it seems to me that we need international cooperation to deal with. You can't build a wall around the UK. In the film this morning about the Attlee government, there was a whole section about exchange controls, and nearly did the government in when they were removed, but we can't realistically reimpose exchange controls now. We can't have a sort of socialism in one country. I mean, that idea is surely dead in the water. So if we're actually withdrawing from multinational economic organisations like the EU, surely that sort of decreases our ability to get some control over tax avoidance.
Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, more or less.
Well, just a quick plug for the Tax Justice Network, which I chair, and I was the executive director for many years. Our focus is entirely on the international side aspects of this. We recognised that the rules of the game, that is, the rules that were created by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development in the post-war period, reflected imperial interests, the imperial interests of the European, including UK, and North American capital exporting countries, and not the interests of the rest of the world, quite the opposite. They were designed to undermine the interests of the rest of the world. So our focus was on creating a new set of rules. We haven't got there yet, but we've seen some progress in some areas. For example, we've seen some progress towards greater transparency. In other words, information sharing has become a great deal easier between countries. So when capital migrates out of Britain, and that's of course Britain's capital led the way, because we created this spider's web of tax havens precisely to let British capital migrate elsewhere and then come back dressed up as foreign direct investment, with all the tax breaks and other breaks that go with that. That's beginning to be eroded. And it was interesting this week in Luxembourg, there was a meeting of the World Bank and the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, etc., etc. And they all seem to totally share our arguments and our policy measures in that area. Also interesting now that it's increasingly recognised in the context of the single market, that Amazon's activities and Apple's and all the rest of the multinational companies are not so much just anti-social on tax, it's actually anti-market. Of course it is. So it's anti-democratic and anti-market, and these are the measures, the countermeasures. They're now accepting that. So we now have the possibility for influencing a new world order. John McDonnell understands these issues intimately. I've worked with him since 2003, and he knows very well, and always has known, precisely, that these are the areas where we need to engage effectively at the international level. Don't disengage from the international, re-engage, but I would say take it beyond the European Union. This is what the United Nations was created for in the first place, to create initially the Bretton Woods settlement. Now we need a bigger and bolder Bretton Woods settlement, which will recognise that you cannot have perfectly mobile capital without a framework of rules which allow us to tax it and regulate it.
So,
Can you take it
Oh, do you
all?
need to? Oh, sorry. John, so are we all right? Oh, that's fine.
All
Carry-
night.
all night. Carry on, Cat.
You're
Sorry,
building
sorry.
your world, you know. Carry on.
Just on Brexit, I think there's a political opportunity around Brexit in terms of, you know, the biggest reason that people voted for Brexit was that they wanted decisions about the UK to be made in the UK. And so, you know, it could go either way. We could, if we have a government like the one we have now, we could still end up being dominated by all these multinational interests. But arguably, there's a lot of support for public ownership from leavers as well as remainers, and we've done polling that shows that the levels of support are equal. For you know, and obviously there's nuances of that, but I think the whole take back control, I think people will be really disappointed if take back control doesn't mean take control of our public services.
Right, yes.
Okay, I don't want to dampen all this happy talk, but if we don't get a change of government in the next 3 years or so, we're going to be rushing into these into international trade agreements. That's what they're called, but they're actually will lock in corporate interests at the international law level. So the whole thing is designed to first of all call it trade so that nobody argues with it, but they're all absolutely corporate interests, the interest of transnational corporations, and to lock them in such a way that makes it very hard for subsequent governments to get out of it. I don't know if we did get a change of government. I don't know where the Labour Party stands on trade agreements. Maybe you do if you're working closely with them. The first thing though is to drag them out into the light, because the current run of things is that they are secret until they're negotiated. Sorry, until they're completed. So I think it's important when we talk very much at the national level, but there are these international stuff going on in the background, and they are designed to lock us into the very stuff that we're trying to get away from.
No, I don't know enough about where Labour is on these things. I suspect they're more with you and me. I've discussed this in the past, and I suspect they're pretty suspicious about locking ourselves into any further agreement. Certainly, that was the position around Europe's engagement with the transatlantic treaty. There was a great deal of scepticism about that.
Yeah, the trouble is, like, when you're talking about overturning rhetoric, we haven't even started to crack the trade rhetoric. I don't think to overturn that. It's a very, it's very solid, this sort of like trade agreements must be good, how many can we get into as fast as possible stuff. We haven't even started to crack that and say, hang on, what's in these trade agreements, what they're really about. So I think that the rhetoric is really strong on that, and whereas other things are moving, that's an area that has not started to move yet.
Well, I think that Trump has chucked a hand grenade in here over the Bombardier thing, and goodness knows how the fragments of that are going to shatter across the world, because we are now entering a very real possibility of trade wars, as we saw in the 1930s. It's a very worrying situation, but it's at the same time, when these things happen, all sorts of old treaties start breaking up.
Should we start dressing as pirates? Should we start dressing as pirates?
Pirates.
That's the way.
Just another very quick observation that in the same way that we've been conditioned to conflate freedom of expression with some people have with Murdoch owning half all of the British media. the same way free trade has the concept of free trade as a good thing has become this hegemonic idea, which you even see going back to the issue of Colombia and the Labour Party. You know, we're talking about their support for the the Uribe government, but this idea of like if governments address their human rights problems, they will get a free trade agreement. This idea of free trade as a present, as something good, when in reality, you know, you read Harju Chang or you study economics or you study how the British developed or East Asia developed on the basis of protectionism. Free trade has never actually led to the development of any country, and it's basically employed as a gimmick to take advantage of comparative advantage in technology and to fleece poorer governments. So again, there's a political education or whatever you want to call it, job to be done on exposing the myth of free trade and the supposed benefits that it does benefit, but it benefits the corporations. It doesn't benefit the majority of those that engage in
I mean, there is a job to be done very simply on the word neoliberal. I mean, we all sort of understand, you know, we all get it, but I think the wider population have no idea. I read somewhere to just characterise it as capitalism with the gloves taken off. That's how. Olivier.
No, my question was more down to earth, but is there any talks? I see a very strong connection between public ownership or shared ownership and our relationship as citizens with tax. The people at the level, you know, everybody resent tax. Have a so there is a kind of mindset. Talking of mindset and preconceived ideas, there is a very negative notion associated with tax and taxation. And is there any talks or any ways of how to readdress that issue of tax? Because in fact, tax is our contribution to the social contract, which should be the contract of the society that we want to be in, and we should enjoy paying our tax. We should regard it as our contribution to the club to which we want to belong. It's our society, it's our money, and it's our government. Our money contributes to that. So share ownership of railways, of water supplies, whatever, would be essentially with our money, or it ought to be felt that it is our money. So is there any talks about how to address that issue of how, you know, people, the reaction people have to PAYE and so on and so forth is extremely negative?
I just have to stand up and say that in my humble opinion, it's because of the work John and Richard Murphy and the Tax Justice Network have been doing since the early 2000s that tax is being talked about in the way that it is at all. I mean, I remember so clearly when the non-DOMs, it was when the financial crisis hit, and you were all in there with the non-DOMs issue to begin with. But before that was 20 years of work on trying to make people understand that we are nothing if we don't tax.
Yeah, but as an employer, I just want to add one thing, is that I think the PAYE system was introduced also at around this time, this period, post-war period. And the PAYE system, although at the time was perceived by people as everybody contributing and people were aware that they were contributing to national health, to their social security and so on and so forth, nowadays has completely disenfranchised people. All my employees have no idea how much tax they pay. Not only they don't have any idea, they don't even care. They don't even know that there was an element for NI, an element for tax. And that, the fact that they don't feel it's their own money, they don't feel it's their money. They all feel it's my liability. It's their money.
Now here's a radical proposition. But before I go down that route, I would say that the Tax Justice Network, my mission, and I was commissioned to do this a few decades ago, was to reverse this whole idea that the left should be frightened of taxing and spending. Surely that is the key role of the government.
Yes.
Isn't that what we elect them to do? We don't elect them to stand around making lovely platitudes. We elect them to do something, spend money on our behalf. And what we wanted to do was to overcome the Labour Party and other left-wing governments' fear of taxation. And because Tony Blair was so fearful of it, he didn't want to mention the word. And it was pathetic. Gordon Brown was the same. And of course, what they did, this gets back to my earlier comments about the cowardliness of New Labour, was they continued with the trend of taxing ordinary people, VAT, reducing our allowances, stealth approach, all sorts of other stealth taxes, whilst engaging in a global competition to bring corporate tax rates, in other words, taxing capital, lower, further, down, down, down. In other words, they became new capital, not new labour. The radical proposition is, and there's only one country in the world that does this, is to introduce tax into the secondary school curriculum for citizenship. Because that's actually the heart. You mentioned the social contract. How dare you? It's the heart of the social contract.
It is.
And yet we teach people next to nothing.
It's in the Declaration of Human Rights.
Of course it is.
The taxation is part of it.
And it's always been the most contested part. More revolutions have been fought over tax than anything else. Which country, the gentleman asks, would you believe it's Uganda? They had a fantastic finance minister, I can't remember her name, who introduced it to the curriculum about 10 years ago. Brilliant. How revolutionary is that?
But people's attitudes on tax differ depending how you ask the question. And if you ask the question, would you be prepared to pay more tax to fund our NHS? People are absolutely willing to pay more tax, despite all the sort of negativity around it. So I think linking it to public services and making the case these are our public services. We pay for them, we use them, we work in them, we own them. That's really, really important. And it can increase that sense of ownership so that we have a real sense of democratically and fiscally.
And it involves people and as citizens, it empowers them.
Exactly.
One more objection as an employer with the PAYE is that it removes it from their own, it feels it's not their responsibility. Well, in fact, it isn't anymore. It's the responsibility of the employer to pay it, to calculate it, to report it, and the employee doesn't, I mean, most people wouldn't be unable to say how much they've paid unless they get their
well, they all get their P6.
Yeah, but it shocks them, but they don't even.
But look, I mean, the problem with PAYE, of course, is it only covers employed people, and we don't have the same applied to rentiers and landlords and self-employed and
But is there a project of reform for that?
We should do.
But we also need to say, okay, here's your NHS as an NHS sign. This is your NHS. This is our NHS. And the same for other things, the railways, for example, we could have that on physical things around us. We could remind people, you've paid for this with your taxes, and that public money is a good thing, and here is your service, and it's great.
So a couple more questions, and then we'll have a quick wrap up. So yes, the lady in the blue at the back, did you want a question? Yeah, okay, so this gentleman here, yeah.
Yeah, my interest is actually how we can...
Oh, sorry, there's a man behind. Oh, God, without my specs.
There's four.
So there's Paul. You had your hand.
Me. Yeah.
Okay, go the man behind, and then yourself. Sorry, I didn't. Yes.
Maybe a bit of a naive question, but the Attlee government, in a short period of time, managed to bring in some astonishing measures that lasted a long time, but they lost power. What degree of fear do you have that if a government came in now, with the people that we've been talking about and the sort of policies, would they have power for long enough to implement those?
And maybe do you want to ask your question, and then we can...
It's just really, I want to find out how you get hold of the money that's in offshore tax havens, many of which are actually owned by Britain. And the other thing too is slightly related, I suppose, is that foreign investors coming in, investing in the property market of London. They don't live here. It just hikes up the cost of everything, including the cost of rents. And money, a lot of it could be very, very dirty money. It could be, money laundering, scams, and dodgy regimes that take the money out of the country and try to make it clean by buying London's property.
Yeah, quite right. Can I begin by talking about? I mean, it's true that it led to a defeat, but in some respects there was a great victory, because what had happened was, Kate mentioned the Overton window. The Overton window had shifted to such an extent that subsequent governments, Macmillan and so on, have moved so far to the left because of Keynesian practices. No one at that stage was challenging the NHS or seriously challenging so many of the measures, the Education Act and so on, which were brought in at that time, quite the opposite, to the extent that you'd hear Tories saying we're all socialists now. for those of us, remember back. They would, some of them would have liked to have reversed it, but they recognised the public had bought in to what Attlee had said. And I think that was a sign of success in the same way that Thatcher, when questioned about her greatest success, said Tony Blair and New Labour.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And even now, when we're doing this campaign with other NHS campaigners on the NHS, and we get replies from Tory MPs saying, this government will not privatise the NHS. We believe in a publicly owned NHS. And it's like, what does it mean when you're giving contracts to private companies? And, but anyway. But I think, your question goes to the heart of what we'd like to see post this Labour government, which is shifting the debate means the next Tory government doesn't feel that it can go back on public ownership, that it recognises that public services are best run in the public sector and they're best run in a way that they belong to all of us, and that's the case not just for the NHS but for all these other areas: railways, water, energy, council services, social care, all of these areas, that they recognise that we need that mixed economy.
Well, I take both the points you're saying, but nonetheless, if the Attlee government had a further 5 years, it might have achieved a huge amount more that would have let things shift even less. But point taken.
There was a tax question.
Well, this was a question about the City of London and how money can be brought back on shore. First of all, there has been remarkable progress at an international level in the last 10 years around information exchange, increased transparency of multinational company reporting. We're seeing that's being built into the new international financial architecture. What we haven't got so far, and we're pressing hard, is to have full disclosure of who owns these offshore companies, and it must be on public register. Sorry, what we haven't got so far is full public disclosure of who owns these offshore companies. And I think one of the things that John McDonnell understands, and Jeremy Corbyn, is we will have no public procurement from offshore companies unless they disclose who they are. Full disclosure right the way down the chain, and that includes, and this will break the British tax haven model, include disclosure of who sits behind offshore trusts, because that's been the core of the British offshore tax haven model, and that's very revolutionary, and we can expect a lot of kickback on that.
Yeah, a lot of kickback.
Okay. Last two questions. The lady in the blue was patient, and then
two very quick comments. One was you've missed out education, of course, which is being privatised dramatically, both at school levels, with academies, where they now own our buildings.
Education, she's saying we've missed off education, which is being privatised at all levels.
We've got the first private medical school. We've got the first private medical school, the first private university.
First private medical schools and universities,
so it's preventing other things that are happening. And very briefly, going back to the point about the misunderstanding that the NHS is free, we pay national insurance, we pay an insurance, the same as if you had a private medical insurance. It's a complete misdemeanour that people don't seem to understand. You do pay for it, and it is, just as they said, it is ours.
Yeah.